Well, I just want to give a brief introduction for the class. This is Donald Harper. Um, he is the Centennial Professor of Chinese Studies in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations at the University of Chicago. He is a journal editor of the journal Early China and a specialist in the Warring States period, the Qin and the Han dynasties. You may also be interested to know that Professor Harper was the thesis advisor to Sabina Wilms, who did the translation of the Jingui that we'll be using in class. So welcome, Dr. Harper. Thank you so much for being with us. It's a great honor to have you here.
Okay, thanks very much for setting this up. I'm looking forward to really talking again about medicine and the manuscript evidence especially.
Great. And so I first came across your work with regard to your book, Early Chinese Medicine, which was a translation you did of the Mawangdui manuscripts. Would you mind giving just a brief introduction to those manuscripts for the people who may be unfamiliar with them?
Basically, it was a discovery, an archaeological discovery from 1973. The Cultural Revolution had just wound down, and it was a fantastic find in Mawangdui of 3 tombs, and the third tomb was found to have a large lacquer box, and inside the large lacquer box there were sets of manuscripts written on silk stacked up. Some of the manuscripts, medical manuscripts, were on slips of bamboo, but most of them were written on silk. The initial work of recovering and restoring the manuscripts, which were, after all, over 2,000 years old, the tomb itself was dated 168 BCE, took place in rough terms over the next decade, so that by the late 1970s we began to see transcriptions. My dissertation was done in the early 1980s. In fact, it wasn't until later in the 1980s that we were able to see good photographs of all of the manuscripts. And one thing I can report in terms of just the way in which we rely on archaeology to give us the manuscripts is that last month they finally published every manuscript from the Mawangdui tomb. And I've got the volume here. This is one volume of 7 volumes which publish all of the manuscripts. So in addition to the medical manuscripts, there were philosophical texts, including the Lao Tzu and the Tao Te Ching. There was a copy of the Zhou-yi, the Zhou Changes, the Book of Changes. There were several sorts of historical texts, and there were quite a few texts that fall into the category the Chinese call shu-shu, calculations and arts that in a way are occult. They concern divination, various kinds of astrology, numerology, choosing of lucky days, places, and times. And now we have 7 volumes just out since last month that give us photographs of everything from the tomb, medicine and everything else, along with the critical scholarship of a team of Chinese specialists in manuscript studies who have added a new layer of critical annotation to all of the manuscript material, including the medical manuscripts. So that's a rough take on just the nature and significance of Mawangdui as a major site for early Chinese books. And of course, then also for early Chinese medicine.
Great. Well, that's really exciting to see all those volumes finally being published. So, in terms of the manuscripts themselves, this tomb, who did it belong to? Is this a sort of everyday Chinese family, or was this more a noble of some sort that had these manuscripts? Do we know?
The Mawangdui tomb, we know that the family, there were 3 tombs, were local aristocracy. We also know that tomb 3 was the tomb of a son in the inheritance lineage of the local noble title. We don't know exactly which son, and by saying we don't know exactly which son, it means that scholars still argue. based on the transmitted historical sources that are surviving from the period, still argue about which son it might be. But it's definitely a burial of three tombs separate, but one is the mother, the famous Mawangdui Tomb 1, where the corpse was perfectly preserved. One is the father, and the third is the son, which had all of the manuscripts in the tomb. So they're aristocracy.
Okay. And what is your take on the nature of these manuscripts? Are they from one source? Do we have an idea of what these medical writings in particular might represent? What tradition or schools of thought did these manuscripts belong to?
This is where it gets a little bit complicated, and I'll try and explain the situation. When we had the Mawangdui manuscripts, there were no other manuscripts from the centuries BCE available. It meant that all of the efforts were focused on how we can relate the Mawangdui medical manuscript texts to the Huangdi literature. Now, shortly thereafter, in the 1980s, a second site was discovered, and it wasn't so far away from Mawangdui. It was in Hubei province, and it's a place called Zhong-jing, and tomb 247, which dates to roughly the same period, mid-2nd century BC, as the Mawangdui tomb, had, again, a collection of manuscripts, two of which were medical manuscripts, and one of the medical manuscripts had a number of texts which corresponded to Mawangdui medical manuscripts. So by the 1980s, we had a second group of manuscripts that we could relate to Mawangdui manuscripts. Now, excitingly, we have two other sets of manuscript material that have yet to be fully published. One we'll get to, I think, sometime during our discussion today, was a discovery made just last year in 2013. And it was a tomb in Chengdu City in Sichuan province. The site is called Lao Guanchan, and again, the tomb dates to about this same period of sometime in the 2nd century BCE. A large collection of bamboo slips with medical manuscripts. They represent, because of dialogues between a physician and a student, evidently a medical tradition that can be related to a famous legendary physician named Bian Cue. But in addition to those theoretical texts, there were a number of recipe texts, and one of the recipe texts actually numbers the recipe categories. It's not only ailments, it includes hygiene for cultivating long life, but it numbers them with an elaborate table of contents, and in the initial published report they only give two examples, but it compares very favorably to Mawangdui. There was also what I call the mai-vessels. So there was a vessel theory text. You'll recall that the Mawangdui manuscripts that concern the mai theory or the vessel theory do not mention acupuncture. There's no reference of any kind to acupuncture in Mawangdui manuscripts. However, the mai theory texts do associate individual mai or vessels with a list of ailment categories, and at the end of that list of ailment categories say that whenever these conditions exist, use jiu, cauterization. In the Laoguanshan manuscripts just discovered last year, they do everything except the final instruction about use jiu. So in the newest manuscript evidence of vessel theory, there's no reference to either acupuncture or to cauterization.
Interesting.
Now, there's a fourth group of manuscripts that we're waiting to have further reports on, and they are currently being kept at Peking University. They were manuscripts that are looted and then, in a sense, cleansed in Hong Kong and then reacquired, in this case by Peking University, and this is happening all too often recently. It happened with a collection of manuscript material owned now by the Shanghai Museum, another collection of manuscript material owned by Tsinghua University in Beijing, another collection owned by Hunan University in Hunan province, and now this material all owned by Peking University. The Peking University material that represents Han Dynasty, again, has a major collection of medical manuscripts, including both theoretical vessel theory texts and also primarily pharmacological recipes. The table of contents that's been explained in brief publications from Peking University includes over 180 categories of ailments. So it's quite remarkable. And again, we're waiting to see this information published so that we can begin to quantify the numbers of drugs that are mentioned. See what kind of other information there is about the relationship between ailment categories and drugs. See what kinds of therapies are employed in terms of internal, external, and all kinds of information like that. So we have four major collections. We have four major collections of manuscript material. It means that we're really on the edge of being able to now describe Chinese medicine before the Huangdi literature. It's not just a simple question of in what way can we see that we can validate the Huangdi literature by finding original manuscript material. It's a question of reconstructing the world of Chinese medicine before there was a Huangdi literature.
Well, that's really exciting. From our end, I know that's what led me to your book on early Chinese medicine in the first place. I'm curious, the find in Lao Guanchan and Mawangdui, in terms of the mai-vessel theory, how similar are those pathways that are described? Are they fairly parallel to one another?
There's only been a brief excavation report published for the whole tomb, and in the brief excavation report, they quote, I believe, 3 passages from the Mai theory text. What has been determined is that it is related, of course, but the relationship between the Mawangdui vessel theory texts and the Huangdi Neijing texts that describe the paths of the vessel, those two are closer. The Laoguanshan text is more different, which has led some people to think that, well, maybe this represents a bianchui tradition. One question that then comes up immediately is that in terms of our knowledge from the transmitted sources, historical sources, we have a major source for early Chinese medicine in the biography of a man named Chun Yui, which is preserved in the historical records, the Shiji of roughly 1st century BCE. The information about vessel theory in his biography also does not match well with the Huangdi literature. And the idea is that perhaps, and yet there's also a lot of reference to the relationship between Chun Yui and bianchui. The idea is that perhaps with this discovery in Sichuan province in Chengdu, we may be getting another kind of tradition, one perhaps which may help us understand the medical theories that were used by Chun Yui, which contrast with medical theories being used in the Huangdi literature.
Well, that's very interesting. Would you mind speaking a bit? We've talked about the vessel theory now. Would you mind speaking a bit about the wu-xing bingfang, the prescriptions for 52 ailments? I was going back over your introduction to the wu-xing bingfang, and it seemed like you were hinting that there may be a connection between that text and the Shennong Bancao.
To date, and that includes all 4 of the bodies of manuscript material that I've just described, there is nothing that is a close counterpart to the Shennong Materia Medica. Okay. Meaning that with the Shennong Materia Medica tradition as a formalized textual tradition, we seem to be seeing the systematization of a certain, in a way, ideological perspective on drug use. Mm-hmm. And we don't have the same evidence of a theory with a kind of ideological background in any of this pharmacological recipe material.
Okay. And the one thing that's often struck me that I did when I taught Herbs 1 and that I'm doing in this class with regard to the wuxia or bingfang is it seems to sort of straddle the lines between, let's say, like more magico religious type herbal healing and then more practical herbal recipes like we might see in a later formula book like the Shanghan Lun or the Jingui Yaolui.
I would complicate the situation a little bit by wanting to, in addition to the 52 ailment manuscript, mention the other two manuscripts that relate to recipes for cultivating vitality. I call it macrobiotic hygiene, because when you talk about drugs, one of the things that we have evidence now from all four groups of manuscript materials is that it's not just a matter of crossing different kinds of lines of connection as you just described. It's also embracing drugs taken to enhance vitality. So it's not just a matter of knowledge of drugs for the purpose of physicians treating ailments. It's a matter of knowledge of drugs so that people in their everyday lives who have access to this knowledge can increase their vitality and longevity and enhance their performance in various fields, including sexual activity.
Right. And that actually brings me to a terminological question I had from one of the sexual manuals, actually the He Yin Yang. There's a term in there that appears twice. That is, you've translated as spirit illumination. It's the term Shen Ming. I was curious about this term because it appears in the preface of the Shanghan Lun. It also appears in Huangdi Jing Suwen Chapter 5. Can you give us a little bit of a better understanding of how you interpret that term Shen Ming?
I would say, on the one hand, that what we find in the medical manuscript material does not necessarily correspond with the level of understanding of technical terms that we might find either in philosophical texts from the pre-Han period. The great golden age of classical philosophy includes this term Shenming, and uses it in a rather abstract way sometimes, almost for a way of referring to intelligence. And at the same time, when it's used in Huangdi literature, it may be part of a theory that is developed beyond its usages in perhaps more ordinary circumstances as we find it in the manuscript material. One thing that I think is important to recognize that is most obvious in the manuscript material is that this term Shen Ming, or I call it spirit illumination, is quite concrete and physiological. That it's the direct result of sexual intercourse in the He Yin Yang text. That if in fact the man, as he undertakes the act of sexual cultivation, is successful in also bringing his partner to orgasm, it's at that point that you have the potential for Shen Ming to be realized. And this is all quite different, I would say, from the use of Shen Ming as a philosophical term, or perhaps even Shen Ming as a term for some element of a systematized medical theory in the Huangdi literature.
Very interesting. I often think when I read that passage, perhaps they're just describing sort of that afterglow.
But they've added through the successful performance of the technique, they've added to their well-being in material terms.
Sort of that sexual alchemical tradition, then?
Yes, although I would still insist that it's not Taoism.
Okay.
Too often, I think, when people think about anything that has to do with cultivation that involves internal things, they instantly think, "Oh, that's Taoism." It's quite clear from all of this manuscript material we have now that there was quite definitely within early Chinese medicine a whole distinctive tradition of acts, of ideas, knowledge, and activities which were pitched to a clientele, and it was just part of hygiene. It wasn't part of any sort of Taoist body of ideas. Whatever is Taoist in the medieval period, in some cases, grows out of this common core of medical hygiene from the ancient period.
Great. Well, thank you for making that clarification. I know there's a lot of confusion amongst many Chinese medicine practitioners as to what in the medicine is Taoist and what is Confucian, and there's a lot of overlap, particularly, of course, in the Huangdi literature. It's being that it's a compilation of different sources, it seems to sort of straddle all those categories at once and embrace none of them as a whole. I have another question about a technical term, the term wu-yi. Can you describe that term a little bit?
Here we're talking about the magico-religious influence on early medicine.
Yes, because historically, my understanding is that the Huangdi literature and the Shanghanlun and Jingui represent sort of the break from sort of the shaman as healer and creates a new category of healer, which is the physician or the specialist in acupuncture and herbal medicine. So if you could just talk about Wu Yi in that context, perhaps.
Okay, so first, as far as I think it's always important to know when we're talking about evidence that comes from actual manuscripts of the period, and when we're talking about evidence that represents historical traditions, which because of their being recorded in historical texts, and because of those historical texts being transmitted down to the present day, means that there's a strong ideological bias. It means that certain people in power had an interest in seeing that these ideas were recorded in that fashion, and that later generations thought them important to be preserved as the sort of cultural memory of what has value. And it means that the criticisms of Wu-yi that are constant in the transmitted medical literature, in the Huangdi literature or in the historiographical texts, represent a tension in the society at that time. We don't find that tension in the manuscript material. We don't find references to any category of practitioner at all. What we do find, however, as I've pointed out when I did the translation of the Mawangdui medical manuscripts, is a very open kind of fluidity with regard to what kind of knowledge was regarded as proper medical knowledge. So in the Wu Shi Bingfang, in the 52 ailment recipe manual, there's no distinguishing in the way in which that text is composed between the recipes which are sophisticated drug use or the recipes which are sophisticated use of incantations and exorcisms. They're there side by side. To the extent that we have other manuscripts that show us that combination, again, there's no implicit criticism of the knowledge, one kind or another. That the use of a drug material because it has apotropaic exorcistic properties when used magically is no different from the use that it may have because it's poisonous or because it has other kinds of chemical properties that we associate with its active nature as a drug in medical use. Wu-yi. It's a little bit like another term called feng shi, the so-called recipe gentlemen, or sometimes called the magicians. It's one of these highly charged words that we don't know whether it refers to a legitimate social group in the society of the times who have their own identity and their own sets of ideas and their own clientele, or whether it represents a kind of negative epithet
Ah,
used used by, say, a certain group of physicians, perhaps even against other physicians whom they don't like. But again, perhaps a way of distinguishing a kind of knowledge which is seen to be new and distinctive, distinguishing that knowledge from more ordinary practices which may be more closely associated with the knowledge and activities of people like shamans. Because we do know that shamans were in local communities. It's quite definite that in the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st centuries BCE, many people, by choice, went to shamans for their problems, not to physicians. The question is, to what extent people with specialized knowledge, people who put that knowledge into written texts, and who made that knowledge circulate in the kinds of manuscripts that we're discovering today, what was the nature of the interaction of ideas within that large group of people, and in what way are we to see the exclusivity of the knowledge that is contained in the Huangdi literature? But much like a Hippocratic corpus, there are claims made in the Huangdi literature about this absolute separation between the so-called magical and the empirical theoretical. But as you look closely at the Huangdi texts themselves, you can see that it's much fuzzier than the strong claims would make it seem.
right. Well, thanks for making those clarifications. It's very important, and it's great. I'm happy that the students will be able to hear your perspective on that, because it is important to understand what represents the what we see in the manuscripts versus perhaps what got passed down, and to some degree how the political currents of the time influenced how we view certain medical practices even. Um, you mentioned the poisonous substances, which made me think of the aconite species. Um, they're used in the Wuxia Bingfang, and they're often used in the work of Zhong-jing, which is what we'll be studying this semester. Is there anything you can any light you can shed on the use of aconite in the Wuxia Bingfang?
Let me ask you first, how is it used by Zhong-jing? How does he process it? Does he describe how to process it?
Yes. Typically, he's referring to fuzi, which is the processed lateral root, I believe. So it's not as strong as the main root. And typically, the processing involves, I believe, steaming with ginger. He uses it to rescue the yang. There's a very famous formula called sini tang, which is used in the Xiaoyin stage, which is a stage where the patient is described as being in basically the fetal position, very cold. So they're on the verge of death, and so he typically uses fuzi in his prescriptions in order to kind of wake the person back up, or restore the yang, bring some vitality back. In modern Chinese herbal classifications, it's classified in a section of substances that are seen to invigorate the Mingmen fire.
So the use is internal.
Yes.
It's taken internally.
Yes.
Since in Wuxia Bingfang, I actually took a quick look back at my own introduction. It's been a couple of decades. But the interesting thing was that first of all, it is the product which is known by the drug name Wu Hui in the Wuxia Bingfang.
Okay.
And in fact, whenever it occurs in other early manuscript material, the name consistently used is Wu Hui. And it's a little bit difficult to know in what way the drug named Wu Hui relates to the specificity that you're able to associate with Fuzi in terms of exactly the part of the root. We just know that it probably refers to the same plant and probably refers to the root part of the plant. All of the uses in the Wuxia Bingfang are external.
Okay.
So
And
it's not being used internally. Now, what's interesting is that, to my mind, in terms of its inclusion in a drug recipe, the more interesting uses of Wu Hui or aconite in the Mawangdui medical literature are in the macrobiotic cultivation recipes. And it's a little bit similar to what you just described. You wake someone back up, because it's always used in recipes where you want to increase someone's vitality. You want to increase their ability to undergo long, to have endurance. Whether it's endurance for things like running fast so you can travel long distances, or endurance for sexual cultivation activity. And it's in those recipes that it is taken internally. Now, it's not associated with yin or yang, but it's associated with increasing vitality. And I think that's very important.
Oh, interesting. And I should note also, we also in Chinese medicine, and I believe in certain recipes from the Jingui, there's another herb that's referred to as either Cao Wu or Chuan Wu, and that is, I think, possibly the stronger aconite variety, the unprocessed, really toxic variety that perhaps they're talking about in Mawangdui. It's often used for like severe like wind and cold in the channels.
My recollection is that they're mostly skin conditions.
Okay, interesting. Well, I appreciate the piece about the macrobiotic use of Wu Hui. I'll have to check back and look at that again. So I do want to transition into the Lao Guanchan since you've prepared some slides for us and it's sort of new and exciting. But just before we completely head in that direction, you have mentioned the Huangdi literature. And I'm just wondering if you have any final thoughts on the relationship, if there is one, between the Mawangdui manuscripts and the Huangdi medical literature.
Very complicated, after all. Then the real specialist, the authority on all of this now, of course, is my good friend and colleague Paul Unschuld, who, as you know, has published a very finely annotated translation of the Su Wen, the so-called plain questions, and has also done a lot of study of the sort of background of Huangdi medicine in the ancient period. I would, from my own perspective, and this is really just an opinion. I mean, I'm not primarily an expert in or authority on the Huangdi literature itself. In my own opinion, and it's a measured opinion, but it's definitely an opinion that represents a judgment on my part, I find the Huangdi texts very ideological. I've used ideology as a term before, and I mean it slightly negatively, because it seems to me that part of systematizing medical knowledge between the 1st century BCE and the 1st century CE, which is roughly the period when I think we now think of the Huangdi literature as having been formalized. This wasn't always the case. Initially, with Mawangdui, the Chinese scholars first assumed that, well, of course the Huangdi literature is already very old. It must be at least as old as the 3rd century BCE. And therefore the Mawangdui material, even though the tomb is only the 2nd century BCE, must be even older than the Huangdi literature. So they weren't willing to think of the idea that there wasn't always a Huangdi canon coming to us from the pre-Han period as the Bible. I think now, especially with 4 groups of medical manuscripts and the lines of connection that you can draw between the knowledge in those medical manuscripts and the parallels in the Huangdi literature, is that the Huangdi literature itself is very much a product of the period of the, again, 1st century to 1st century BCE to CE. And it seems to me that this is also the period when so-called yin-yang and 5-agent correlative thought is coming into a very definitive form. And I really myself see the Huangdi literature as primarily serving to ground a medical perspective in the ideology of yin-yang and 5 agents. That in so many ways, what is most important, what is most contested in terms of the claims and the criticisms in the Huangdi literature is really the primacy of a kind of correlative thought which is very intricately grounded in yin-yang and 5-agent ideas. And we simply can't say that about the medical manuscript material, and probably not about the medicine that came before this time of the canonization of a Huangdi medical literature.
Great. That was a wonderful description. Thank you. So let's move on to the Laoguanshan information. I know you provided some slides for us, which I appreciate. And this is fairly new to me as well. I recently sort of stumbled across it maybe 2 or 3 months ago when I was doing a little bit of research on Bian Chui, actually, and it popped up that the Chinese, of course, being very culturally proud of these heroes, particularly in the medical world, were describing that a lot of these texts from Lao Guanchan may represent the first received text we have of the Bian Chui literature, corpus, if you will. So can you tell us, just give us a background on Lao Guanshan and that particular find and what it represents to Chinese medicine in particular?
Again, my knowledge is very sketchy, but just a year ago now was when they made major public announcements of the tomb discoveries at Laoguanshan. And there were, I believe, 4 tombs. And so it's tomb 3 that has most of the medical material. Tomb 1, however, tomb 1 had so-called occult texts, meaning things like, again, love charms, ways to use magic to determine the sex of a child, other kinds of occult techniques. So tomb 1 also had textual material, but it was tomb 3, and again they do mostly archaeological dating. There's nothing in the tomb that gives an exact year date, but based on archaeological analysis of the tomb itself, the goods inside, these tombs date roughly to the mid-2nd century BC to the early 1st century BCE. The medical manuscripts are important, and I'm quite anxious for them to be published. I've been trying to keep track with colleagues as politely as I can, because after all, until they're formally published, no one who's had access to them can say anything about them. All of this is regarded as proprietary information until formal publication takes place. I did, however, go out of my way to invite myself to a Qin and Han historians conference in Chengdu last August, specifically for the purpose of being able to visit the Chengdu City Archaeological Institute, which was responsible for the Lao Guanshan tomb excavation. And in my mind, the most spectacular object that had been publicized was this lacquer figurine of a human figure, which everyone instantly says is an acupuncture model. But that's just to give it a label without knowing what it meant to the people for whom it was originally made. It did in the announcements, it was described as having red and white lines on it. Now you may recall that about 20 years ago there was another similar lacquer figure discovered also in Sichuan province at a place called Mianyang. And there have been several articles published about that, not so much in the Western literature, although there was an important article in the journal Early China that when I was the editor, that described this Mianyang figure. It was 28 centimeters high, the earlier one, and not in such good condition. This Lao Guanchan lacquer figure that was found together with the medical manuscripts is 14 centimeters high. It's about the height of a ballpoint pen. It's tiny in the sense of how much are you going to show of the vessels, and so-called acupuncture points in a figure that is only 14 centimeters high. The other aspect of it is that it's quite gorgeous. And this first picture, if it's visible to you there, I see it up on the screen, was one I took in the warehouse where the objects from the tomb were being kept by the Chengdu City archaeology team. And I could only see it face up. And they wouldn't take it out. It's floating in a basin of purified water. But you can see it has a sort of an inscrutable face. You can't see it so clearly here, but it does have a very large navel. It's so shiny because it's in the water that it's very difficult to see any of the fine lines, and even more difficult to see whatever sorts of small dots might represent some form of identifying places along the mai that are strategic, presumably strategic for the purpose of manipulating qi. But again, these are all open questions. But is the next image down there?
There we go.
This is an image of the backside as it was published in the journal Kaogu, or Archaeology, in October. So that first picture I took in August when I was actually at the archaeological team's warehouse in Chengdu. This is the backside, and you'll notice those lines up by the shoulder blades. Mm-hmm. They sort of form loops that go towards the middle of the spine.
Yes.
Right. Now, all of these lines do not look to us like they're just the classical 12 that form the basic mai theory or meridian theory in the Huangdi literature. It seems fairly clear that other kinds of lines that we know about, other kinds of channels, are also put onto this figure. But we're awaiting a full report by the archaeologists. Again, very little has been stated. But if you show the next slide, there's a remarkable detail. And can you see right at the midpoint between where those two loops go towards the backbone at the top? Right there. Can you see a graph there? Just a little bit low, a little bit lower. There it is. A little bit up, a little bit up, right there. That's the graph for heart, shin.
Oh.
As you descend, as you go down, there's a total of 5 graphs. That's the second one. Down a little more. That's the third one. Down a little more. That's the fourth one. Down a little more. That's the fifth. The names of the 5 organs are inscribed down the spine. Now, cool. What I discovered was after I got back to my office in Chicago from Chengdu, I hadn't been able to see the back of the figure. I'd only been able to see it face up. I found an image online, and this is the image you see here, that was on the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences archaeology website, and I could blow it up, which is why you can barely see these graphs now that are inscribed on the back side. It was only then that I realized that this 14 centimeter high lacquer figure is an exact correlative cosmology microcosm of 5-agent theory, because Heart is at the top of the spine. Heart is the direction south and is the agent fire. Below heart is lung. You got to keep going up. There it is. That's lung, fei. Lung is west and the agent metal. Fire conquers metal. Below that is gan, liver. Gan is east and is wood. The metal of the lung conquers the wood of the liver. Below that, and this is the most interesting, it doesn't say P. P, spleen, in all of the medical literature, the transmitted medical literature, it's P, or spleen, that is the organ among the wu-xing of the center.
Right.
This one says wei, stomach. There's only one text in all of transmitted literature that identifies wei as the organ of the center, and that's the Huainanzi geographical treatise. So it's the only place where the listing of the wu-xing and the correlation with directions and with agents gives wei as the zang, the organ of the center associated with earth.
Wow.
In any case,
That's fascinating.
Liver above it, which is wood, conquers the earth of the center, which in this list is the stomach. At the bottom, of course, the only one we have left are the kidneys, shen, which is water and north. And, of course, earth conquers water. Now, most importantly, of course, is that all Chinese maps are oriented with south at the top. And so here we have a human body that is specifically oriented so that heart, south, fire is at the top, and north, kidney, water is at the bottom, which means it's an exact correlative model based on yin-yang wu-xing theory. And if you look at the next slide down that I included, this is a standard vision of the internal organs as we find it in a Ming Dynasty wood block. This is from the late 16th century. And you'll notice, of course, that lung is at the top because the lungs do form a kind of set of leaves draped over the other internal organs, and heart is underneath it. And this would be more or less corresponding to an empirical view of the positioning of the organs inside the body. It means that in that Lao Guanchan figure, purposely for the sake of five-agent correlative cosmology theory, heart was moved into a position above lung because it represented south, which is one end of the pole in cosmology, contrasting with kidney, north, and water at the bottom. And so right there on the back, along the spine of this 14 centimeter higher lacquer figure from Lao Guanchan, we have the specific information that this lacquer figure was regarded as a model of the cosmos. Now, what that all means in terms of either medical theory or, say, macrobiotic hygiene, what it means for someone cultivating their body to be able to think of their body as an exact counterpart to the cosmos as they knew it. These are all very, this is the first time we've ever had this kind of evidence. And what's most remarkable, of course, is the seemingly unempirical placing of the heart above the lungs.
Wow. Well, I'm
This is
very
the first time
excited
it
that
has.
you were sharing that with us.
Yeah, it hasn't been published yet.
All right. Well, you heard it here first. Thank you, Dr. Harper, for sharing that. With regard to the stomach, the spleen, as the earth phase, could you talk a little bit about the earth as the central position, where the idea was that the earth represented the transitional time between seasons?
This again gets a little complicated because of trying to figure out exactly how it was that five agent theory comes about. And you'll notice that I'm consistently using agent for Xing.
Right.
But that in part it relates to work that's ongoing now with a colleague, Mark Kalinowski, who works on early Chinese cosmology. And we have a current project studying the so-called hemerological texts. These are the manuscripts that have been called Urshu or day books and are sometimes called almanacs. But they provide us with our oldest manuscript evidence of the beginnings of five agent theory. And one of the things that comes out of the usages of the system of the wu-xing as we find it there is that we find much evidence that we should not treat these terms as abstractions. So that the idea of a Xing as an evolutive phase, as something abstract, as part of a system that is one stage away from the actual physiological materiality of the body itself, but rather is describing certain kinds of processes in more purely cosmological terms, that just does not hold true. And it seems equally that if you're dealing with early medical ideas, that it's quite important that we understand that they did not see these so-called phases, if that's how you want to see a cycle, as abstractions. They saw it as a transition that involved a high degree of materiality. So that when we think then of Earth and center, I think this is important because after all, in early Chinese world views, let's take death for example. Earth is also central because Earth is the underground, which is the point of focus of what happens to people when they disappear from the surface of the Earth. So that all of the associations with Earth before there's a five-agent theory are very strongly with this kind of centrist notion of Earth as a point of focus below ground as well. The underworld is the yellow springs. But if we're looking to five-agent theory, the other thing that's interesting is that the so-called spleen or now spleen stomach, of course the two are related closely in medical theory anyway. It's just interesting that in the standard Huangdi literature, stomach becomes one of the six, the Liu Fu, the six Fu organs, whereas it's always Pi that's one of the five Zang organs. But Pi Wei are very closely related. It's a compound, even in the ancient literature, Pi Wei. In some of the pre-Huangdi literature enumerations of the five organs, the heart is at the center. We don't know what agent it is. We're just talking about the position of the organs relative to one another, and the heart would be quite naturally regarded as the organ of the center because the heart is the point of organization for the body. It's where the mind is. It's where the so it's really only when you get to the medical literature of the Han Dynasty that you begin to see the heart displaced from the center. And then you tend to see reorganizations. There are several enumerations that occur in the philosophical texts from the pre-Han period. There are several enumerations of what are the wu-zang. And the sort of final systematizing, as we find it in the Huangdi literature, is the one that puts the Pi or the spleen at the center and associates it with earth. And now we know from the Lao Guanchan figure that in other medical contexts, it was the Wei, the stomach, that was the zang, the organ of the center. I should state that the Lao Guanchan figure does not explicitly name agents, but it's perfectly obvious that heart at the top means heart is south because south orientation is south at the top.
Right.
Kidneys at the bottom, shen, definitely is north. It's quite obvious in that north-south axis that heart is fire at the top and kidneys are water at the bottom. So it's perfectly obvious then that it's got to be stomach that is earth, and it has to be at the center. It can't be anywhere else. Um, but I think these ideas about earth center and determining which organ is best correlated with earth and center does come out of five-agent thinking. Because in five-agent thinking, there was a much stronger rationale to associate heart with fire.
Well, thank you for that clarification, and enumeration of the theory with the lacquer figure. It's really exciting that you've shared that with us, and I'm very grateful about that. If I might ask one final question, this is the one I've been saving. It's a very loaded question, but since you did do your work on the Mawangdui texts and the Mai, what do you believe that the Mai, as described in the early texts, represent a circulation system for qi, or are they describing the blood vessels and arteries, as some have suggested?
I guess basic, to me, intuitive point number one, and it's based on my reading of the Mawangdui medical manuscripts, and it's based on the Mai theory texts as well as what I call the macrobiotic hygiene texts, is that I'm firmly convinced that qi moves inside the vessels. Now, that itself represents a certain kind of position, because there are people who don't want to restrict qi to something that is contained inside a specific channel. And they find various reasons to try to conceptualize how qi is in the body without necessarily running like rivers through channels or mai. But my own reading of how qi, especially in the physical cultivation activities, how qi is directed to this place or that place, it just makes sense that the mai forms the system for those transitions of qi from one place in the body to another to take place. That's point number one. Point number two, transmitted sources do juxtapose mai with blood. Medical manuscripts, not just Mawangdui, but the Zhong-jing, which is fully published, and a couple of examples to illustrate from the Lao Guanchan and the Peking University manuscripts suggest the sort of dual idea that, sometimes there's mai qi, there's vessel qi, and sometimes there's mai xue, there's vessel blood. It just so happens that in the couple of examples of theoretical statements in the Peking University medical manuscripts, there's one that talks about how things are generated, and it talks about how it describes a process where it says that qi generates the organs, the zang. The zang generate the mai, the vessels. It's a sequence, right, of sort of developmental sequence. So you go from qi to zang, to organs. So the point of transition between the cosmos and qi to the human body is primarily through organs. Now, is this a gestation description? I don't know, because it's more like relating cosmogony to human physiology than, strictly speaking, describing gestation. But you go from qi to zang organs, you go from zang organs to mai, and in this Peking University text, you go from mai to xue, blood. So it's qi sheng zang, zang sheng mai, mai sheng xue.
Great. Well, thank you for that description. It's very, very, it's very, very helpful, and it's great again, to have your perspective. I know we're about to wrap up, so I just want to again thank you for meeting with us and talking with me and presenting the information on both the Mawangdui and the Lao Guanchan. I can't overstate what an honor it is to speak with you today.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.